In a dark city where shadows grow and justice is often threatened, Emma Johnson, the daughter of a black FBI agent, finds her life turned upside down in an instant. She is walking down the street, enjoying the evening air, when she is suddenly approached by a police officer, Sergeant Michael Brown, known for his prejudiced views and brutal methods. "Where are you going, girl?" he growled when he saw Emma. She tried to explain that she was just going home, but his anger only grew. Soon she found herself in handcuffs, and the sergeant's cold gaze left her with a feeling of terror. Meanwhile, her father, FBI agent Jeremy Johnson, sensed something was wrong. He knew his daughter could be in danger, and when he learned of her arrest, he gritted his teeth, his eyes burned with rage, and he vowed to take action. 3 minutes later, when Emma was already at the police station, her father took matters into his own hands. As he approached the building, he realized that he had to act decisively. The tension was mounting, and each step echoed in his heart like a gunshot in the silence. He knew he was risking everything, but did Sergeant Brown know who he was dealing with? What do you think will happen next? How do you imagine a father who is ready to do anything to protect his daughter? Write in the comments what is your name and where are you watching this video from. Your thoughts are very important to us and help us develop the channel. Enjoy watching. Emma Johnson was walking through her evening neighborhood, smelling the street food and hearing her friends laughing, when her calm was shattered by the sharp sound of brakes. A black police SUV pulled up next to her, and Sergeant Michael Brown stepped out, a nasty grin on his face. "Hey, you!" he shouted, pointing at Emma. "What are you doing here, girl?" She froze, not understanding what was happening. "I'm just going home," she answered quietly, trying to remain calm. Brown stepped closer, his gaze full of disdain. "Aren't you ashamed to be hanging around here alone? This isn't your place." His voice was menacing, and Emma felt anxiety welling up inside. "I'm not guilty of anything," she cried, retreating. "I'm just going home." "Shut up," Brown cut her off roughly, grabbing her arm. "You're under arrest for inappropriate behavior." Emma tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. "Daddy, help!" she screamed, desperation filling her voice. Brown pulled her to the car, ignoring her screams. "You shouldn't bother your daddy. He can't save you. I know who he is, and I'm not afraid of his connections." At that moment, in the FBI office, Jeremy Johnson, a black agent, felt panic rising inside him. When he heard about his daughter's arrest, his heart stopped. He knew that this was not just an arrest, it was an act of hatred and prejudice. "What's going on?" he shouted as his colleagues began to gather. "Where's Emma?" "Sergeant Brown arrested her," one of the agents replied, his face contorted with concern. "We can't interfere, this is a police matter." "I can't believe this is happening," Jeremy muttered, anger and fear mixing in his chest. "He won't leave her alone. I have to save her." As soon as he hit the streets, his thoughts were filled with terror. He knew that Brown was prepared to do anything, and now that his daughter was in the hands of this man, he knew he had to act fast. Meanwhile, Brown was already pushing Emma into the car, her heart pounding with fear. "You thought you could just walk around this neighborhood without consequences? You don't know who you're getting into." He laughed as he closed the door. Outside, Jeremy raced toward the police station, his mind filled with thoughts of how brutally Brown might exact revenge for his humiliation. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered to himself, bracing himself to face his fear. "I won't let this go," he said, his eyes blazing with determination. "Brown will pay for what he did." Emma sat on a cold bench in the police station, her hands shaking with fear. Sergeant Brown sat in the corner of the room, watching her with satisfaction. "You know you weren't supposed to be here," he said, crossing his arms dismissively. "Your dad can't save you. He's an FBI agent, but I'm on his side." "He's coming for me," Emma replied, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "He won't let you hurt me." Brown just chuckled. "You don't understand how much power I have. This isn't just an arrest. It's a lesson for people like you. You may think you're part of society, but you'll never be like us." Outside, Jeremy burst into the station, his heart pounding and thoughts racing through him. He knew time was running out, and if he didn't intervene, his daughter would fall victim to Brown's cruelty. "Where's Emma?" he shouted, striding toward the officer on duty. "She's in the interrogation room," he replied, looking at him warily. "But it's best not to interfere. This is a police matter." "I'm not leaving her alone with that racist," Jeremy barked, his voice thick with rage. He knew it wasn't just his daughter's safety that was at stake, but his honor as a father and agent. Brown, sensing the tension building, walked out of the interrogation room and toward Jeremy. "Agent Johnson," he said with a grin, "I hope you're not going to make any unnecessary moves. I have your daughter under control." Jeremy glared at Brown. "You think you can just treat her like that? It won't go without consequences." "The consequences? What a funny sight that would be," Brown replied, rubbing his hands with glee. "You know I have connections and you don't." "You have no idea who you're messing with," Jeremy said, cold and determined. He knew Brown was more than just a cop. He was the embodiment of all the evil he'd seen in his career. Meanwhile, Emma, hearing their conversation, felt her fear turn to anger. "Daddy," she screamed, clenching her fists. "I'm not afraid of him." Brown chuckled again, but at this point his face became serious. "How naive you are. Emma, don't you understand what he can do to protect you? This isn't just a game." "I won't let you humiliate my daughter," Jeremy said, moving closer to Brown. "I'm going to get you." A sense of injustice bubbled up inside him, and he knew he had no choice. He was willing to do anything to protect his daughter, even if it meant breaking the law. As if sensing his intentions, Brown leaned closer, his voice turning ominous. "You don't know what I'm capable of. I can make you regret ever having her." There was a heavy silence inside the station, and as if time had stood still, Jeremy knew he couldn't back down. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to fight. "This isn't going to end the way you think," he said, and his words were full of determination. Jeremy stepped forward, and in that moment, everything changed. The revenge that had been waiting in the wings was preparing to come out. Like a caged beast, he knew that for his daughter, he would fight to the last. "You're really going to fight me?" Brown chuckled, his eyes sparkling with malice. "You have to understand that this isn't just a fight, it's a war. If this is war, I will fight for my family," Jeremy said, feeling the adrenaline building inside him. He remembered all the sacrifices that had been made for justice, all the people whose lives had been ruined by hatred, and he decided he couldn't take it anymore. At that moment, a cracking sound came from the interrogation room. Emma, sensing her father's determination, suddenly stood up and took an active part. "Dad, I won't sit idly by. We can work together if we join forces." Brown, realizing that control of the situation was slipping away, narrowed his eyes. "What are you going to do, little girl? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know what you're doing is wrong," Emma said, her voice hardening. "You're using your power to bully. It's not fair." Brown just chuckled at this. "Justice is a fantasy for weaklings. I make my own rules, and you can't stop me." Meanwhile, Jeremy noticed other police officers starting to gather in the hallway. He knew Brown might try to turn this to his advantage. "Emma, come on, we need to get out of here," he said, eager to act quickly. "But how?" she asked, her eyes full of worry. "I know how to stop him," Jeremy said, a plan forming in his mind. "If we can get them to see his true colors, it might help us. We need to create some buzz." At this point, Brown, sensing that something was wrong, turned around and shouted, "Did you all hear that? This is a riot. I have the right to use force." Jeremy knew this was his chance. "No, this is not a riot. This is a fight for truth. Brown is using his position to intimidate us and our loved ones." His voice filled the hallway, attracting the attention of the other officers. "He arrested my daughter without cause. It's illegal," he shouted, confident that the truth of his words could change the situation. Some of the officers began to exchange glances, and Jeremy noticed that some of them, however reluctantly, were beginning to doubt Brown. "You're lying," the sergeant shouted, but there was fear in his voice. Emma, realizing what was happening, added, "We must stand together. This is not just my story. This is the story of everyone who suffers from bias and hatred. We deserve justice." There was a murmur in the hallway, and Jeremy saw some of the officers begin to stir, as if succumbing to her inspiring words. They looked at Brown with doubt, realizing that whatever he was doing might be wrong. Brown, realizing he was losing control, became aggressive. "You'll all regret hearing this. I'll punish every one of you." But his words didn't sound as confident as before. Jeremy knew this could be a decisive moment. "Emma, come on. It's now or never," he shouted, and together they began to move towards the exit, making noise and attracting attention. The officers began to discuss what was happening, and some began to take steps forward to stop Brown. Jeremy felt hope ignite within him, but he knew the fight was just beginning. As Jeremy and Emma began to move towards the exit, the tension in the hallway reached its peak, as if waiting for a spark to start a fire. Several officers stood in their way, but their expressions changed as they realized what was happening. "We can't let this go on," one of the junior officers said, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is wrong. Everything you do is wrong, Brown," another shouted, his voice carrying a determination that had been missing before. "We can't tolerate this kind of behavior in our department." Brown, realizing his power was slipping, turned sharply on his colleagues. "You all want to rebel against your brother cops? This is treason." His face turned red with anger and he stepped closer, trying to intimidate those who dared to challenge him. "This is not betrayal. This is justice," Jeremy responded, his voice full of strength. "We must fight the systemic injustice that plagues our society." Emma felt a surge of confidence. "We're not alone, Dad. People who know what bias really is. They won't stay silent." She looked at the officers who were starting to gather around them and saw that many of them were already beginning to think about their own actions. "This is not just my story," she continued, her voice clear and strong. "This is the story of everyone who faces racism every day. We cannot remain indifferent." Brown, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, rushed toward the door to call for backup. "You're all going to regret this," he shouted, panic evident in his voice. But despite his threats, Jeremy and Emma were already pushing through the crowd of officers, each step bringing them closer to freedom. When they finally made it outside, the fresh air and sounds of the street enveloped them, and Emma breathed a sigh of relief. "We did it, Dad," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. But Jeremy knew this was just the beginning. He was consumed by the desire to act, and he knew that fighting the system would not be easy. "This is just the first step," he said, looking around. "We have to unite people, show them they are not alone. Justice is not just a word, it is an action." Meanwhile, Brown, realizing that his plans were falling apart, went out after them. "I'll find you," he shouted, and his voice echoed through the street like thunder. "You will pay for your words. You won't be able to intimidate us," Emma shouted, full of confidence. "We will fight." But their joy and determination might not last long. Brown knew people, and his connections in higher places allowed him to act with impunity. Jeremy knew they had to act fast, before they became a target not only for him, but for the entire system that protected people like him. "We need to find support, people who stand behind us," he said, looking at Emma. "Let's tell our story. Let's start by reaching out to local activists. We need to gather people who understand what racism is in practice." Emma nodded, her mind already forming a plan. "Let's use social media. We can create a wave of support and show that we're not alone." At that moment, they felt the danger growing. Brown could try to make moves to stop them, but Jeremy knew that if they joined forces with those who also fought for justice, they could create a powerful movement. "Let us not be afraid," he said, his voice firm. "We are not alone. We are the voice of those who suffer. The time to act has come." Jeremy and Emma headed to their car, their hearts pounding with excitement. They knew they had to act quickly and decisively before Brown got reinforcements and started picking them off. "Dad, let's make a video," Emma suggested as they settled into the car. "If we tell our story, it will get people's attention. We can show that we're not alone and get support." "Good idea," Jeremy agreed, feeling hope creep into his heart. "But we have to be careful. Brown will be watching us, and he has connections. We have to be prepared." Emma turned on the camera on her phone and, gathering her thoughts, began to speak. "My name is Emma Johnson and I am the daughter of an FBI agent. Today I was a victim of police brutality. Sergeant Brown arrested me without any reason simply because I am black. It is unfair and I am not alone." Jeremy, feeling anger rising in his chest, added, "I am Jeremy Johnson and I am a police agent who has been fighting racism for many years, but I never thought that my own enemy would be part of the system I serve. We must fight this injustice and create change." The video, uploaded to social media, went viral. Hundreds of people began commenting, sharing, and supporting them. Every like and repost brought new hope to Jeremy and Emma, but with it came danger. They knew that Brown might already be seeing their words being weaponized against him. Back at the station, Brown scrolled through the comments under the video, his face contorted with rage. These two think they can just go against the system, he hissed, feeling his power and control slipping. I'm going to end this. He began to gather his contacts, knowing that his only recourse was intimidation. Call anyone who can help, he ordered his colleagues. We must make sure they are silenced. I will not let these two ruin my career. Outside, Jeremy and Emma continued to receive support, and soon local activists and communities joined them. They began organizing rallies, focusing on racial justice and police accountability. Emma felt her voice growing louder, and Jeremy grew prouder of his daughter with each passing day. At one of the rallies, while Jeremy was addressing the crowd, he noticed people starting to move toward the stage. Hey, look, it's that Sergeant Brown, someone in the crowd shouted, pointing at the approaching Brown. Brown strode forward with determination, his face set in stone. You all think you can just go against the law, he shouted. I've come to put a stop to this. The crowd, feeling threatened, began to buzz, and Jeremy knew he had to act. Don't be afraid, we are for the truth, he shouted, raising his hands to calm the crowd. This is our moment, and we will not be silent. Emma felt a surge of strength as she stood next to her father. You're all here because you believe in justice, she said, her voice like the sound of bells. Brown isn't just one person. He's a symbol of the entire system that's trying to suppress us. We have to unite and speak up. The crowd began chanting their names, and even Brown felt fear creeping up on him. This won't end well for you, he said, his voice shaking with rage and fear. I'll take care of you. But this time, Jeremy wasn't going to back down. He knew that fear was what kept the system going, and they couldn't let Brown use it against them. You can't intimidate us, Brown, he said, feeling the anger boiling inside him. We've been on our knees more than once, and now we're going to fight. At that moment, when the tension reached its limit, a new chapter in their struggle began, a struggle full of unpredictable turns, and Jeremy knew that they had to be prepared for any outcome. The crowd continued to chant Jeremy and Emma's names, and even those who had previously remained in the shadows now came forward to support them. Brown, realizing that his authority was beginning to crumble, tried to take control of the situation. He addressed the crowd with arrogant disdain. You all don't know what you're doing. This isn't just a standoff. This is your undoing. You are a symbol of all those who oppress us, Jeremy replied, his voice clear and confident. You are not just a police officer. You are the embodiment of a system that protects bias and hatred. We are not afraid of you. Brown, feeling panic creeping up on him, tried to change tactics. You're all too naive. This isn't your war. The police are acting for the good of the community, and you just don't understand. But at that moment, several people in the crowd began shouting out their stories of police brutality, of the hatred and bias they had faced. Emma felt her heart skip a beat as she heard familiar voices expressing the same pain they had faced. I was stopped simply because of the color of my skin, one participant began, his voice shaking with emotion. I was humiliated and insulted simply because I am black. These are not just words, this is my life. Others began to pick up on him, and soon the crowd had become one, full of determination and strength. Emma turned to Jeremy and said, we have to give them a platform. Their voices have to be heard. Yes, Jeremy replied, and they began organizing small performances, giving the floor to anyone who wanted to tell their story. Each story exposed a deep wound in society, and Brown, standing among them, felt the ground shift from beneath his feet. Meanwhile, journalists had appeared in the crowd, their cameras catching every word, every emotion. This was their moment to grab the attention of the general public, and Emma knew they had to use it to their advantage. We have to make this video go viral, she told a group of activists. We can show how we stand together and that we will not be silent anymore. Brown, seeing his power fading before his eyes, tried to leave the meeting, but Jeremy was not going to let him go. You are not leaving until you answer for your actions, he shouted, raising his hands to draw attention to Brown. The crowd turned their eyes again to the sergeant. Answer, someone shouted, and many voices took it up. Brown, feeling surrounded, became nervous. I was doing my job, he shouted, but his words were full of panic. This is just part of the system, and you don't understand what it requires. We understand what this system is, Emma replied, her voice clear and confident. A system that makes people suffer, a system that turns a blind eye to injustice. We will not submit to it anymore." The crowd began chanting again, and soon the crowd had become a powerful current in which everyone felt their strength. Brown, realizing that his threat was not working, began to push himself out of the crowd, trying to avoid escalating the conflict. But then other police officers, hearing the noise and seeing what was happening, stepped in. Instead of siding with Brown, they began to realize that the support of the people was more important than fear of their colleague. "We can't ignore this," one of them said, slowly approaching the crowd. "I've experienced racism myself. We have to stop it." This support became a signal to others, and several officers began to leave their ranks to join the protesters. Emma and Jeremy exchanged glances, realizing that they were on the right track. "This is not just our fight," Jeremy said, addressing the crowd. "This is a fight for all of us, for those who suffer from hatred. We cannot leave this issue in the shadows." The crowd began to rage, and at that moment, Jeremy realized that they were creating something more than just a protest. They were creating a movement that could change society. But Brown wasn't going to give in that easily. He was still full of hatred and would do anything to regain control. "This is not the end," he whispered to himself, realizing that the fight was just beginning. The crowd continued to grow in strength, and Jeremy and Emma felt every word, every speech, resonate more and more. People came out on stage, sharing their stories, and it created a powerful atmosphere of unity and determination. Excitement and anger filled the hearts of everyone present. Brown, taking a step back, knew his reputation was on the line. Feeling the pressure mounting, he decided the only way to regain control was to act tough. "I'm calling for backup," he shouted, trying to intimidate the men again. "You're all breaking the law." But Jeremy was ready for this. "We do not break the law. We demand justice and equality," he shouted, and the crowd took up his words, creating a powerful chorus of voices that shook the air. "You don't need to intimidate us, Brown," Emma added, her voice confident. "We're not here to be silent. We're here to tell the truth." The crowd began to chant, "Justice, equality." Each cry strengthened their resolve, and even some of the police began to waver, realizing that they were on the side of truth, not oppression. But Brown wasn't going to give up. He pulled out his phone and started dialing, knowing it could cause more trouble. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, looking at the assembled group. "I'm going to call someone who will put you in your place." Jeremy, not wanting to waste the moment, came closer. "You think your threats will scare us? We know who you really are, and we will not allow you to use your power against us anymore." At this point, several more people who had previously been hesitant to speak up joined the crowd. "I was detained for no reason," one said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I was humiliated simply because I am black. I don't want my children to grow up in that world." Those words sparked a conversation, and many of those present began sharing their stories, creating a thread that connected them all. Jeremy and Emma felt this community begin to grow into real power. "We are not alone," Emma screamed, her eyes shining with determination. "We are here to change the system. We will fight for our friends, for our families, for our future." The crowd began to murmur, and Brown felt his control slipping away. His aides began to waver, and he realized that his fear was no longer working. "This won't end well for you," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "We are ready to fight," Jeremy replied, his voice full of energy. "Our goal is justice, not fear." At that moment, several other activists approached them, their faces full of determination. "We will organize protests, rallies. We will contact the media," one of the women said. "We will make sure that this issue becomes the center of attention. We cannot be ignored." Jeremy and Emma exchanged glances. They knew this was their chance. "We need to form an alliance," Jeremy said. "Join forces with other groups fighting racism and police brutality. Together we can make a difference." Support began to grow, and soon local media joined in, capturing every moment, every word. Emma and Jeremy became icons of the movement, and their video continued to gain popularity. Meanwhile, Brown, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decided to call for reinforcements. "I won't let you destroy everything I've built," he shouted, realizing that his career was hanging by a thread. The crowd began to close in around him, and Jeremy felt they had reached a breaking point. "We won't take this anymore," he shouted, the words coming from deep within him. "We demand change, and we won't stop until it's done." Emma, picking up his words, added, "We are all together. This is our fight." There was no backing down. Brown, feeling the pressure mounting, began to realize that his days as an oppressor were being combined with his public appearance. The crowd began to rise and the noise in the crowd grew louder, creating an atmosphere of determination. Brown realized that the situation was getting out of control and that he might no longer be able to ignore what was happening in society. Meanwhile, Jeremy and Emma knew they had a lot of trouble ahead of them, but together they were ready to fight for their rights, for the future they deserved. Their battle was just beginning. The crowd continued to grow, and Jeremy and Emma felt like this was the moment that could change everything. They were with activists from different communities, each bringing their own unique story and strength. They knew they had to be united in the fight against racism and injustice. Among the new faces in the crowd, Jeremy spotted his old friend and work colleague, Mick, who had always supported the fight for black rights. "I heard you were here," he said, coming closer. "I came to support you. It's time to act." Mick was tall, powerfully built, and his confident voice inspired the people around him. "We have to form a coalition to fight this. I speak not only for myself, but for my family and friends. We have the power, and we can't ignore it." The crowd took his words in, and many began exchanging contacts, forming groups and planning next steps. Jeremy and Emma felt a strong network of like-minded people forming around them. Meanwhile, Brown, seeing that his efforts to intimidate the crowd were not working, began to lose control. His emotions flared and he shouted, "You will all be held accountable for your actions. I will find you and you will regret this." At this point, a woman named Layla, an activist well known in her circles, joined the crowd. She was a well-known figure in the fight for women's rights and racial equality. "Sergeant Brown," she said to him, "your threats are no longer working. We know we are right, and we will stand up for ourselves and each other." Her words became inspirational, and the crowd began to cheer again. Layla looked at Jeremy and Emma. "We need to organize rallies all over the city. This isn't just a local issue, it's a national problem." Jeremy, picking up on her thought, said, "Yes, we can bring attention to our struggle. The more people we gather, the louder our voice will be." Brown, realizing he had lost control of the situation, tried to call for help. "I'm not leaving until I put an end to this," he shouted, but there was already a hint of desperation in his voice. They were soon joined by another activist named Kevin, a young black man who had lost a friend to police brutality. "I know what it's like to lose someone close to you to a system that doesn't protect you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "We have to fight not only for ourselves, but for those who are gone." The crowd was silent at his words, and a sense of grief and determination hung in the air. Jeremy, sensing that this emotion could be a powerful tool, said, "We're not just protesting Brown, we're protesting an entire system that leaves people without protection. We need to make our voices heard." Meanwhile, Brown, watching the situation unfold, realized that things were taking an unexpected turn. "You're all just a bunch of hooligans," he shouted, but his words sounded less and less convincing. "You'll soon see who the real hooligans are," Mick replied, his eyes flashing with anger. "We'll make sure justice is served, and we'll do it legally." The crowd began to roar again, supporting Mick. People began handing out leaflets with information about rallies planned for the coming days. Emma felt like she and her father were truly part of something bigger than just a protest. "We will not be silent while racism and oppression exists," Emma screamed, her voice like battle music for many. "This is our country and we have a right to equality and justice." At that moment, the sound of sirens could be heard in the crowd. Brown had indeed called for reinforcements. People began to get nervous, but Jeremy raised his hand to calm them down. "Don't be afraid, we know what we're fighting for. This is our history, and we're writing it ourselves." As reinforcements approached, Jeremy realized they had to act quickly. "We need to move to a safer location, but not abandon the protests. Let's move to the city council and let them see us in full force." The men began to move, forming a single whole, and Brown felt his influence weaken with each step. The situation grew tense, and soon the threat of a clash was in the air. "This isn't over," Brown whispered, realizing that his enemies had united and he was losing control. But Jeremy and Emma knew their fight was just beginning. More trials lay ahead, but together they were ready to fight for justice. The crowd moved quickly towards the city hall, and the tension grew. Jeremy and Emma walked ahead, surrounded by activists, and behind them, the sound of sirens increased the atmosphere of excitement. People began to exchange ideas about what would happen next, and who would support them in this fight. "We have to be careful," Emma whispered to her father. "If Brown really has called for reinforcements, the situation could become dangerous." "I know," Jeremy replied, his face set in concentration, "but we can't back down. We have to show that we are many and we are ready to fight." As soon as they reached the city council, a huge flat hall opened up before them. The doors were open, and several citizens had already gathered there, ready to support the protesters. The crowd began to fill the space, and soon the entire hall was filled with energy. Layla took to the makeshift stage and began to speak. "We are here today to show that racism is not just an individual problem. It is a systemic problem that we must solve together." Her words drew cheers and the crowd began to roar. But at that moment, police officers entered the hall, including Brown. His face was distorted with anger, and he immediately began to scold the activists. "You are all breaking the law. Take this show down. You have no right to gather here." Jeremy stepped forward, his voice full of determination. "We have the right to speak. We are citizens of this country, and we demand justice." Brown, sensing the crowd becoming increasingly aggressive, began to back away. "I won't let you do this," he shouted, trying to maintain control. "I order you to disperse." But the activists weren't going to give in. Kevin, standing next to Layla, shouted, "If you want us to disperse, you're going to have to stop us. We're not leaving until our voices are heard." The crowd cheered him on, creating a powerful moment of unity. Brown, losing confidence, turned to his colleagues, "Prepare to arrest. These people must be punished for causing trouble." As Brown gave his instructions, Jeremy and Emma exchanged glances, realizing that a confrontation was inevitable. "We have to act before they start arresting people," Jeremy said. "Emma, find those willing to stand up to Brown. We have to show that we are united." Emma quickly reached out to other activists and soon found several people willing to step forward. "We need to get our stories together. Let's tell how racism affects us all. And let's do it now," she shouted, and the crowd roared in support. Jeremy began organizing speeches. People would take turns on stage, sharing their stories of prejudice and humiliation. Each speech strengthened their unity and resolve. Brown watched, his face growing more intense. However, as several activists began to climb onto the stage, Brown exclaimed, "This is your last chance to leave." "I'm not kidding." Mick, standing in the front row, couldn't take it anymore. "We won't be silent anymore. We've seen what's happening, and we won't let you ignore our voices." At that moment, several more police officers ran into the room, and the crowd held its breath. Brown, feeling more confident, pointed at the activists, "Arrest them all." The situation escalated to a breaking point. The police began to approach the stage, and the audience began to scream, demanding to be left alone. "Don't touch them," Layla shouted, her voice full of energy. "You can't arrest us for telling the truth." The crowd began to move toward the police, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Jeremy felt his heart beat faster. "We have to stay calm," he said, trying to take control of the situation. "Our strength is in unity." At that moment, another activist, Jason, a young man with long hair and tattoos, who was known for his bravery and bold performances, appeared. "Let's show that we are not afraid. We will be here until the end," he shouted, and the crowd took up his words, creating a powerful chorus. Amid the chaos, Jeremy noticed Brown arguing with one of his men. "I can't get them to disperse. They're too persistent," the policeman said, his voice full of fear. Brown, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began to panic. "Don't let them finish what they started," he shouted, but his voice sounded less and less confident. And at that moment, the crowd burst into new cries. "Justice! Equality!" It sounded like a mantra that united them all. They knew that they had to be united, and each of them was ready to stand up for the truth. Jeremy, feeling the tension building, made a decision. "We have to form a human chain around the stage to protect those performing. If we stand united, we won't let them stop us." Emma, realizing that this could be risky, supported her father. "Yes, we will not let them arrest us. If they try, we will resist." The assembled began to form a chain, and it became a symbol of their unity. At this point, Jeremy knew they were on the verge of a significant change, but there was still a risk of violence. Brown, noticing how their unity was growing, clenched his fists and said, "If you do not disperse, I will be forced to use force." The situation was heating up and no one knew how it would all end. Everyone was prepared for what would happen next, and everyone understood that this was only the beginning of their fight. The situation was heating up and no one knew how it would all end. Everyone was prepared for what would happen next, and everyone understood that this was only the beginning of their fight. There were cries of encouragement from the protesters, and activists began exchanging determined glances. Emma stood next to her father, her heart pounding in her chest. "We can't back down," she said, looking at him. "We have to show that we are many and we are not afraid." Jeremy nodded, his face focused. "That's right. Every word we say is a step towards change. We must get our truth out there." At this point, Brown, noticing that the protesters were becoming more organized, lost his patience. "I'm not going to sit idly by," he shouted at his subordinates. "Get the handcuffs ready." The sound of police footsteps approaching the crowd grew louder and the air became tense. People began to look around, realizing that the situation could get out of control at any moment. Kevin, standing in the front row, raised his hand. "We are here to speak out for justice, not to be arrested. We are peaceful protesters." "But that doesn't stop them," Emma whispered, looking at Brown, who seemed ready to give the command to act. Suddenly one of the policemen stepped forward and the crowd froze. "Disperse immediately," he growled, his voice full of menace. The crowd began to get angry, and Jeremy realized they needed to unite. "Listen, we're not here to riot. We're here to make change. If you arrest us, you'll make us even stronger." The cries of encouragement rose again, and the protesters began to rise. Brown, seeing their confidence growing, gave the order, "Forward, get them out of the way." The sirens started to sound again and the atmosphere became tense. Emma, feeling that anything could happen, grabbed her father's hand. "Dad, what should we do?" "We won't back down," Jeremy said firmly. "We'll stand to the end, but we need to stay safe." As the police began to approach, the protesters began to form a human chain, hugging each other. It became a symbol of their unity, and each of them understood that they could overcome fear together. "We are here to be heard," Layla shouted, and her words caused a storm of applause. "We are not just numbers. We are people, and our lives matter." At this point, several people in the crowd began to come forward, ready to tell their stories. Each of them shared experiences of bias and injustice, and this created a powerful emotional impact on those present. Brown, feeling like he was losing control of the situation, shouted, "You are all breaking the law. If you don't disperse, I will be forced to use force." But the protesters were not going to back down. "Justice. Equality." Emma screamed, and everyone around her took up her words, creating a powerful chorus of response. At that moment, the crowd became one, and each person realized that they were part of something bigger. Jeremy looked at his daughter and saw the determination in her eyes. "We can do this," he said. "We have to keep fighting." Finally, the police began to move, but the protesters did not back down. This was a battle not only for justice, but also for their right to be heard. Many challenges lay ahead, but they knew they were ready to fight to the end. The crowd showed no signs of dispersing, and their resolve only grew stronger. The protesters stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to stand up for their rights, even if it meant facing the police. Brown, realizing his team was losing control of the situation, stepped forward, his voice full of rage. "If you don't disperse immediately, I will order an arrest." The crowd held its breath, and at that moment Emma, unable to contain herself, exclaimed, "We are not criminals. We just want our voices to be heard." Shouts of encouragement rang out throughout the room, and many began to rise to their feet, creating an even more powerful unity. Jeremy, sensing the growing tension, put his arm around his daughter. "We are not alone, Emma. The truth is with us, and we will fight for it." At this point, several activists began to move toward the stage to speak. They knew that every word could be decisive. One of them, an older man named Art, stepped forward. His voice, though trembling with emotion, was full of determination. "I have seen how the system has oppressed people for many years. I can no longer remain silent. We must fight not only for ourselves, but also for the future of our children." The crowd responded with loud applause. Emma felt her heart swell with pride. In that moment, she realized that every story matters, and together they can create change. However, Brown, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, gave the order to his men, "Arrest everyone who speaks." The sirens started to sound again and the police started to advance towards the stage. Emma, seeing some of the protesters starting to panic, shouted, "Don't give in to fear. We are stronger than they think." Jeremy took her hand and together they began to move toward the crowd of people ready to support the activists. "Get it together, guys. This is our moment." Suddenly, there was a rumble in the crowd, and one of the police officers pushed an activist who was standing too close to the stage. This became the catalyst. The protesters began to move forward, creating a human wall against the aggression. "Don't touch him!" Kevin shouted, moving forward. "We won't let you intimidate us." The situation was reaching a breaking point. Brown, realizing that the protesters were not going to back down, began to lose control. "You have no right to be here," he shouted again, but his words lost their weight against the crowd's growing determination. Layla, standing next to Kevin, raised her hand. "We are here to show that our lives matter. We are not silent anymore. We demand change, and no one will stop us." The crowd roared in response, their voices merging into a powerful echo. Each person felt that this was not just a fight, it was a fight for their lives, for their future, for justice. But Brown, furious and panicked, continued to press his men. "Get ready to act," he shouted. "No one leaves here until they are arrested." And then Jeremy, realizing that the moment had come, said, "We will not let this happen. This is not just a protest, this is our life. We will stand until we get justice." The phrase became a mantra, and the protesters, full of determination, raised their hands, creating a human wall. Their hearts were full of strength and hope, and they knew that despite all the obstacles, they could change the world around them. The crowd stood as one, determined, ready to face any threat. Each protester knew that now was not the time to retreat. Emma, feeling her heart beat in unison with the rhythm of the crowd, raised her hand along with the others. "We are not alone," she shouted, her voice echoing through the crowd. Brown, seeing the situation getting out of control, began to panic. "Come on, guys. Get them out. I'm not going to stand here and let them do what they want." His aggression only inflamed the protesters. At that moment, one of the activists, a young woman named Sasha, stepped forward. Her voice was full of passion. "We are here because we are tired of fear. Tired of injustice. If you want to arrest us, you will have to go through us." The cheers started up again and the tension was palpable in the air. Jeremy knew everyone was looking at him now. He stepped forward and looked Brown in the eye and said, "It's not just our right, it's our responsibility. We must speak for those who can't." The sirens were still blaring in the background, but the protesters didn't seem to hear them. They were filled with determination, ready to fight for their rights. Emma, feeling the support of everyone around her, added, "We won't be silent until we make a change." Brown shouted to his men, "Come closer. I order you to disperse this crowd." But instead of giving in to fear, the protesters began to sing. It was a song of freedom and justice, and it flowed together. Jeremy felt a fire burning in his chest. "We're not just standing against you, we're standing for peace." At this point the crowd became more united, and even those who had been hesitant began to join in their song. Brown, seeing their unity growing, felt himself losing control. He let out a low roar, "Enough, I will not stand for this." The sirens grew louder, but the protesters did not stop. Layla stepped forward and shouted, "We are here to speak the truth, and if you try to stop us, we will be even louder." The police began to move, but the protesters did not retreat, continuing to chant, creating a powerful barrier of voices and bodies. Brown, sensing that the situation could get out of control, turned to his subordinates. "Action! Get them out of the way!" But the protesters, feeling their support growing, raised their hands in a show of unity. "We are not afraid. Kevin shouted, and the crowd echoed his words. The situation was getting tense. Jeremy knew it was important to remain calm, but at the same time he knew he had to act. If they use force, we have to be ready to stand up for each other. And so, as the police began to rise, the protesters were not afraid. They remained united, ready to face any threat. Emma, looking at her father, felt the confidence growing that they could change the world around them. It was a moment when fear was conquered by the power of unity. Shouts of encouragement and songs of justice filled the air as the protesters stood firm. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew this was just the beginning of their fight. The crowd in the square was determined, but it soon became clear that simply staying put was not enough. Jeremy, noticing the police officers beginning to organize, knew he had to move on to keep the momentum going. "We must go to the main street," he shouted. "There more people will see us and we can attract attention to our struggle." Emma, feeling her heart pounding with excitement, nodded. "Yeah, let's do it. If we can get more people together, it'll send a powerful message." The crowd, full of enthusiasm, began to move towards the main street, where people had already gathered to watch the event. Ahead was a huge square with a fountain, surrounded by tall buildings. This area was the center of the city, and here they could attract the attention of a larger audience. As the protesters reached the square, new faces joined them. Among them was an older woman named Marie, a well-known activist in the community who had spent decades fighting for people's rights. She approached Jeremy and Emma with a determined look. "I heard about what happened," she said. "We must do this not only for ourselves, but for future generations. I will join you." The crowd grew with each passing minute, and soon they were joined by groups of young people, students, and even entire families with children. Marie, standing on a small pedestal near the fountain, said, "Friends, we have gathered here because we are tired of oppression. We will not remain silent." Shouts of encouragement and applause filled the square. Emma felt the energy of the crowd peak. She grabbed the microphone and said, "Each of us is here because we want change. Let's make our voices heard." Meanwhile, in the distance, Brown and his team watched the scene unfold, their faces contorted with rage. "We can't let this go on," he cried. "We have to stop them before it's too late." As tensions grew, protesters began to dance and sing, creating an atmosphere of solidarity. Suddenly, a guy named Daniel, a musician with a guitar, emerged from the crowd. He began playing a familiar tune, and the protesters joined in, creating an atmosphere of unity. As more people gathered around, another activist, Hassan, who had worked for a long time in a human rights organization, appeared in the crowd. He addressed the crowd. "We can make real changes now. We can make our voices heard at the highest level." The crowd roared with excitement, and this gave everyone confidence. Everyone understood that the fight for justice was just beginning, and they were ready to go to the end. Emma, Jeremy and their new allies were full of determination. They knew that there were many difficulties ahead, but together they could overcome any obstacles. Meanwhile, Brown, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began looking for support. He contacted city officials, demanding additional forces to suppress the protests. "If we don't stop them now, they will continue to grow," he insisted. In the square, the protesters continued to share their stories. Every word raised morale. Emma, understanding the importance of staying focused, addressed everyone present. "We are here to change the system. Our struggle is important and we must be heard." With each passing moment, the protest grew, and new locations became witnesses to their fight for justice. This was not just a demonstration, it was a movement that was gathering strength. With each passing moment, the protest in the square grew, and each new voice became louder. Emma, sensing that the atmosphere was becoming tense, addressed the crowd. "We are here to put an end to prejudice and oppression. Our strength lies in unity." Marie, standing next to her, supported, "Each of us has the right to safety and justice. We cannot let the system dictate who has the right to vote and who does not." Shouts of support were heard from all around, and the crowd began to move down Main Street, heading towards City Hall. They knew that this was the place where power and decision-making took place, and this was where they needed to be heard. Daniel continued to play his guitar, and the protesters sang, their voices merging into one. It wasn't just a song, it was a manifestation of their struggle that attracted the attention of passers-by. People from the surrounding shops came out into the streets to join them, and soon the entire area was filled with the energy of unity. But Brown, who had been watching the protest from a safe distance, was trying to collect his thoughts. "We need to act now," he said to his men. "If they get to City Hall, it will be a disaster." Brown, noticing the protesters were getting closer to the building, gave the order to prepare, "Put up barriers. We can't let them in." The crowd moving towards City Hall didn't notice the police officers starting to form around them. Jeremy, feeling the tension growing, turned to Emma. "We have to be ready. If they try to stop us, we can't be scared." Emma nodded. "We have to show that we are not just a crowd, but a movement that demands change." As the protesters approached City Hall, they saw police lining up in front of the entrance. The protesters began to climb the steps, raising their hands. "We are peaceful. We are peaceful," they shouted in unison. There was noise and talk, and the tension was mounting. Brown, standing at the front, shouted, "Get away from the entrance. This is your last chance." But the protesters weren't going to back down. Kevin picked up the microphone and said, "We came here to be heard. We demand justice for all, not for some, but for all." People in the crowd shouted back, and it sounded like a mighty thunderclap. Suddenly there was a crack. One of the policemen stepped forward, his baton raised. "Take your hands off. We will not tolerate disorder." But the protesters, raising their placards and hands, shouted, "Justice, equality, no to violence." At that moment, a new ally joined the protesters, a journalist named Laura, who had been following the movement for a long time. She raised her camera and began filming. "This is your opportunity," she told the protesters. "The world needs to see your truth." Emma, noticing her, said, "Let's tell our stories. Let them hear that we are not just statistics. We are people with hopes and dreams." People started sharing their experiences, creating a powerful emotional moment. Every voice sounded like a challenge to the system, and this gave everyone confidence. But Brown, feeling that he was losing control, gave the order, "If they do not disperse, I will order the use of force." The crowd held its breath, but then Kevin raised the microphone again. "We will not back down. We are here for the future. Justice must prevail." Emma hugged her father, and they both knew the fight was just beginning. This was a turning point. Their movement was not just a protest. It was the beginning of the change they had been waiting for. Jeremy was a black FBI agent with over 15 years of experience. He came into law enforcement full of hope and ideals, wanting to make the world a better place. Since childhood, he had experienced prejudice and injustice, which only strengthened his determination to fight for the rights of all people. Jeremy always believed in the system, but with each passing year, his optimism gradually faded. Working for the FBI was not easy. He saw some of his colleagues displaying bias, and it frustrated him. He was especially upset that such beliefs sometimes even permeated their actions. Nevertheless, he continued his work, hoping that his own example could inspire others. Family was the most important part of Jeremy's life. He raised his daughter Emma with the same values he had learned: honesty, fairness, and respect for others. He always tried to protect her from the realities of the world, but he knew she needed to know what it was like to be a black girl in a society where racism still existed. When the incident with Emma happened, when she was arrested by a racist police officer, it was a real blow to Jeremy. He felt like his world, which he had tried to build for his daughter, had collapsed. But instead of giving in to despair, he decided that he had to act. He became not only her advocate, but also a voice for many who suffer from injustice. Jeremy knew the fight would not be easy. He was prepared to defend Emma and their ideals, even if it meant confronting the system he once believed in. His internal conflict between his dedication to his job and the need to protect his family became the foundation of his resolve. This moment in their lives became the starting point for a fight not only for Emma, but for everyone who faced similar challenges. His love for his daughter and his desire to make the world a better place for future generations gave him the strength to move forward. Even when everything seemed hopeless, Jeremy knew that despite all the obstacles, they had to fight for their rights and justice. The crowd continued to grow and Jeremy felt the energy around him fill every cell of his body. He hugged Emma and at that moment she looked into his eyes, full of determination and passion. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "we can't just stand here. We have to do something more significant." Jeremy nodded, understanding her sentiment. "I know, Emma, but it's not just a question of what we do. It's a question of how we do it. We have to show that we're peaceful, that we're fighting for what's right. But they won't listen to us, she blurted out, her voice filled with hurt. How can we change their minds if they won't even listen? Jeremy felt his heart clench at his daughter's distress. We're going to speak up, Emma. We're going to share our stories. I know what it's like to not be heard, but every voice matters. Emma looked at him, determined. We have to show that we're not afraid. I don't want my friends who are looking at us now to think that we don't care. That's right, Jeremy replied, hugging her tighter. We must be an example to others. Every word, every action is a step towards change. We must act with wisdom. At that moment, the crowd began to sing again, and Jeremy, inspired by the spirit of the protesters, realized that they really could make a difference. You're right, Emma. If we all join our voices, they won't be able to ignore us. Let's go forward. They started walking towards City Hall, and Jeremy took Emma's hand. Remember that we are supported not only by those here, but by many others who dream of justice, he said, looking into her eyes. Emma, feeling her father's support, nodded. I'm ready, Dad. We have to show that there are many of us, and we are strong together. As they got closer to City Hall, Emma held up the microphone. Listen to us. We are here to show that we demand justice. We are not alone. The crowd responded with cheers, and Jeremy felt his pride in his daughter grow. There was a confidence in her voice that he always wanted to see in her. Each of us has the right to be heard, Emma continued. We will not remain silent until we see change. Jeremy looked around the crowd. He saw young people, old people, families. Everyone was here for the same reason. This was more than just a protest. It was a movement, and they were part of it. Let's do this together, Jeremy said, squeezing her hand tightly. You're not alone, and you never will be. Emma looked at him with genuine gratitude. Thank you, Dad. I know that together we can do anything. And in that moment, as their voices joined the cries of the crowd, Jeremy knew that this was the moment that would change their lives forever. Together, they stood on the front lines of justice, and he was ready to give everything for the future of his daughter and everyone who suffered from bias. The crowd continued to grow, their voices merging into a powerful chorus that sounded like one. Jeremy and Emma stood at the forefront, looking at people who had united for one thing: justice. We're not just here for ourselves, Emma said, holding up the microphone. We're here to say that we're tired of fear and prejudice. We're demanding change, and we're not backing down. There were cheers, and Jeremy felt proud as he looked at his daughter. This was the moment they became part of something bigger than themselves. It was a movement that united people of all races and ages fighting for equal rights and justice. Brown, standing at the back, finally realized that his efforts to quell the protests had failed. He looked at the energetic crowd and realized that their determination was unwavering. Doubt began to creep into his eyes. Meanwhile, Emma continued, we will not remain silent until our voices are heard. This is not only our fight, this is a fight for the future, for the rights of every person. The crowd screamed again, and Jeremy felt his heart fill with hope. They weren't just standing behind themselves. They were standing behind an entire society that needed change. Each of them was part of a larger story, part of a fight for justice that had lasted for generations. As they approached City Hall, Jeremy realized that this was not just the end of their journey. This was the beginning of a new era, where everyone had a voice, where justice and equality would be the core values of society. We must remember, he told Emma, that our fight will not end with this protest. This is just the beginning. We must continue to act, educate others, and be a voice for those who cannot speak. Emma nodded. I know, Dad. I want my friends and future generations to live in a world where no one feels afraid because of the color of their skin. A crowd of determination stood outside City Hall, ready to speak, to act, to change the world for the better. Jeremy knew that together with Emma and others, they could create a future of hope, justice, and equality. In that moment, he saw their voices coalesce into a powerful message. They weren't just demanding change, they were becoming a movement that would change the world, and Jeremy was proud to know that his daughter, like him, was willing to continue this fight until justice was served. The crowd surrounding Jeremy and Emma became noisy as they began to walk up the steps of City Hall. Every word Emma spoke was not only a cry for help, but also a manifestation of hope. We are here to change our society so that everyone can live without fear and prejudice. When the protesters approached City Hall, they found the doors open. Inside were officials who were finally beginning to understand the power of this movement. There was a glimmer of uncertainty in their eyes, a sign that the protests had achieved their goal. Jeremy felt a surge of energy and determination. "We come not only for our rights, but for the rights of all who suffer from oppression," he said, stepping forward. "We demand dialogue, justice and change." Emma, standing next to him, raised her hand. "We are ready to speak, but only if we are listened to. We are here to be heard." The words spread through City Hall, and officials began to take notes. Little by little, their confidence grew, and they realized that this was not just a crowd, this was a family, a community, moving toward a common goal. After much negotiation, the mayor agreed to meet with the protest leaders. At that moment, Jeremy and Emma realized that their efforts had not been in vain. This day was a turning point, not only for them, but for the entire city. As the protesters began to disperse, Jeremy and Emma remained in place. "You did it, Emma," he said, hugging her. "You were a voice for so many." Emma smiled, feeling the power of unity overwhelm her. "This is just the beginning, Dad. We will continue to fight for justice, and each of us can make a difference." With the sunset lighting up the city streets, they knew there was still work to do, but they weren't afraid, because they now had support, a community that united them in their fight. Like so many others, Jeremy and Emma's story was just beginning. They were filled with hope that their actions could create a world where equality and justice would be the norm. With that in mind, they returned home, ready for the next stage of their fight, knowing that together they could achieve anything. The next morning, Jeremy and Emma woke up with a sense of change. The news reported on the events of the previous day, how the protests had led to an opening of dialogue between the citizens and the authorities. It had been their day, and they felt that their efforts had not been in vain. "We did it, Dad," Emma said, looking at the TV screen where their performance was shown. "But this is just the beginning. We have to keep working." Jeremy nodded, knowing the real fight was still ahead. "Yes, but we have voices now, and they're starting to hear us. That's important." As the protests continued, more and more people joined in. Jeremy and Emma became active in a local initiative aimed at education and combating bias. They organized meetings, workshops, and events, bringing people together to share their stories and experiences. Their activism inspired many, and Jeremy soon became one of the leaders of the movement for justice in his city. Emma also took part in the organization, engaging young people on important issues. Several months passed, and as a result of their efforts, city officials began to review their policies. They established programs aimed at educating about racism and bias, as well as ensuring equal access to resources for everyone. Jeremy and Emma realized that their fight had led to real change. They often returned to the day it all began, remembering how one brave daughter and her devoted father were able to unite people behind one goal. And while the road to full justice was long, they knew that their actions would mark the beginning of a new era. They looked to the future with hope and determination, knowing that together they could change the world. Thus ended their story, a story of love, determination, and the strength that can come when people come together for the common good. The police officer who arrested Emma faced consequences for his actions after the protests. When information about his racist tendencies and use of force against an innocent girl came to light, it caused a huge stir. After many complaints and demands for an investigation, the police's internal services began an investigation. In parallel, journalists began covering the incident, causing public outrage. Protesters demanded not only justice for Emma, but also accountability for all those who used their power for evil. The investigation found that Brown was not the only one who had shown bias. This led to major changes within the police force. Some officers were fired, others were transferred to less responsible positions. Brown was also suspended from service pending the outcome of the investigation. Over time, public pressure and demands for transparency forced the city to create new protocols and training for police officers. It was a step toward improving the situation, and many residents felt their voices were heard. Although Brown himself remained under investigation, his police career was all but destroyed. He faced public censure and ultimately lost his job. The story became part of a larger movement for justice, demonstrating that there can be serious consequences for people who misuse their power. Dear viewers, we hope you enjoyed this story and that it evoked strong emotions in you. We are interested to know what you think about what is happening. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every opinion is very important to us. You are our support, and we appreciate each of you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like if you enjoyed the video. Thank you for being with us. Have a nice day.